Question number 1, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When inflation is rising and living standards are under a lot of pressure, it is not right to increase income tax for those who are on the basic rate. Does the First Minister agree with that statement?
First Minister.
Well, the Finance Secretary, of course, will set out the details of the budget later this afternoon. That will cover both our tax proposals and our spending proposals. We will seek to protect our vital public services from the cuts being imposed by the Tories. We will make sure we protect those on low and middle incomes, and of course we will invest in business and the economy. And I can tell the Chamber today that 70% of taxpayers in Scotland, 83% of all adults in Scotland, will pay no more income tax after this budget than they do now.
Ruth Davidson.
We do look forward to the details of that later on, but I was asking... But I'm not quite sure, and I can tell by the face, that that flourish will quite have the result that it was looking for, because the reason I asked the question in the statement at the beginning was because those were the direct words of the First Minister herself just this year in May. And I wasn't asking her to reveal her budget, although we're pleased for any details that are forthcoming. But what I was asking her was whether she agreed with herself that all people who currently only pay the basic rate of income tax, which is 2.2 million people in this country, shouldn't have to pay more, because that was the promise she made. And just now, hasn't she just told at least some of them that she's breaking that promise?
First Minister.
I would encourage Ruth Davidson to listen very carefully to the announcements that will be made in just a couple of hours' time by the Finance Secretary. In the budget, of course, we will be balancing a number of different priorities. Of course, as the opposition are fond of telling me, we are a minority government. We require to build consensus around our budget proposals. But of course, we also have to deal with one of the most challenging economic and fiscal contexts that any government in the lifetime of this Parliament has ever faced. As we heard confirmed indeed just this morning on the radio by the Fraser of Allender Institute, our day-to-day spending is being cut in real terms by more than £200 million in real terms next year. Over the next 2 years, Tory cuts will take £500 million in real terms out of the spending this Parliament has available for our nurses, for our doctors, for our teachers and for our police officers. Isn't it a bit rich, in light of that, for the Tories to come to this chamber and lecture anybody about tax and public spending? On top of that, of course, as we found out just last week, every household across not just Scotland but the UK will be facing a bill of £1,400 to pay for the Tories' Brexit obsession. The bill just to rip the UK and, of course, Scotland against our will out of the European Union. So in light of all of that, the proposals we put forward this afternoon will be responsible, they will be balanced, they will protect our vital public services from Tory cuts, they will protect the majority of taxpayers, and they will invest in business and the economy. And in all of that, they will stand in stark contrast to anything the Tories are doing.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister has just revealed that there will be tax cuts in this budget, so perhaps the First Minister should listen to what Scotland's small businesses are saying about that. This week, the Federation of Small Business gave her a blunt warning. They revealed that 3/5 of Scotland's small businesses don't want any change in income taxes rates. They don't want them to go up. 2/3 believe income tax increases would damage the economy. So we're not talking about multi-million-pound corporations here. These are small and medium-sized firms that are the lifeblood of the economy and support 1.2 million Scottish jobs. And this First Minister has just told them there will be tax rises that they don't want. So who should we trust when we know that they're talking about when it comes to growing the economy? Scotland's small business owners, who are warning against the very tax rises the First Minister has just revealed, or the Finance Secretary that wants to push them up?
First Minister.
Well, I actually met with the Federation of Small Businesses just last week. And of course, one of the many things they said to me was how highly they value the small business bonus, the most generous small business rate scheme anywhere in the UK. And I don't think I'm revealing too much. The Finance Secretary is starting to look at me with that worried expression in his face, but I don't think I'm revealing too much when I say the small business bonus scheme will be protected in the budget this afternoon. That, of course, lifts 100,000 small businesses out of business rates altogether. Another way in which this budget will invest in business and in growing our economy. So I think there will be a lot of interest to Ruth Davidson and to others when the Finance Secretary gets to his feet this afternoon to outline how this Scottish Government will protect people the length and breadth of our country from the cuts being imposed on us by Ruth Davidson's party.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, time and time again, ahead of elections, the SNP government make promises to people on tax. And it was only in May of this year that the First Minister was absolutely clear. It is not right, she said, for any person on the basic rate to pay more. That is 2.2 million people in this country that would be protected. And she's just stood up and said that some of them are going to take a hit. This is a simple matter of trust. Promises were made. She's failed to meet them. So how can Scottish workers ever trust her again?
First Minister.
Well, I suggest that Ruth Davidson listens carefully to the budget this afternoon, because when Derek Mackay stands up here and outlines his budget proposals, then much of what Ruth Davidson has been saying over the past weeks will be seen to be complete and utter nonsense. We will set out fair, balanced, progressive budget proposals that protect our public services from more than £200 million in real terms of cuts being imposed by the Tories. Now, that is a fact the Tories don't like hearing. So let me repeat it. Our spending is being cut by more than £200 million in real terms next year. And the proposals we put forward this afternoon will set out how we protect our NHS, our education system and other vital public services from that, while protecting the vast majority of taxpayers and also investing in business and the economy. Of course, I'm not sure how bothered Ruth Davidson really is by all of this, because no sooner have the Tories slumped back into third place in Scottish politics than we have Ruth Davidson setting out her escape plan when she plans to jump ship to Westminster.
Thank you. Okay. Question number 2. Order, please. Question number 2. Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every time we raise Scotland's housing crisis with this government, it spins out the same line. We will build 50,000 affordable homes and 35,000 homes for social rent by the end of this Parliament. This week, new housing statistics revealed that, in fact, the government is way off course from meeting its targets. So can the First Minister explain today how these vital homes will be built?
First Minister.
We have set a target, and we will meet that target, to build 50,000 affordable homes over the life of this Parliament. Now, I know that Richard Leonard wasn't in the last Parliament, so he might not know this, but in the last Parliament we had a target of 35,000 affordable homes over the lifetime of the Parliament. And over the course of that Parliament, we had to listen to Labour MSP after Labour MSP periodically tell us that we had no chance of meeting that target. Well, you know what? We met that target in the last Parliament, and we will meet the new target in this Parliament. And of course, the Finance Secretary will set out funding plans to support that target in his budget this afternoon. And the announcement he makes in this budget, of course, will be part of an overall funding commitment of £3 billion over this Parliament to build 50,000 affordable homes. That's the record of this government. Of course, Richard Leonard is the latest leader of the party that, when it was last in office, managed to build the grand total of 6 council houses.
Richard Leonard.
Yeah, I seem to recall there was a redefinition of the target in the last session of the Scottish Parliament. The shortage of affordable housing is a key cause of homelessness, so we should be thankful for the important work being done by the Homelessness Prevention and Strategy Group, which has fought for government funding to help rough sleepers this winter. But as long as the supply of affordable housing is stalling, and as long as this government cuts local authority budgets which provide housing support, which provide temporary accommodation, which provide funding for women's aid and refugees, the strategy group is fighting an uphill battle to prevent homelessness. And listen to the director of Shelter Scotland, Graham Brown, who earlier this week said, and I quote, "Some people think homelessness in Scotland is getting better and can be fixed overnight. Sadly, over the last year, things got worse." Does the First Minister agree with the director of Shelter Scotland that last year things got worse?
First Minister.
This government is increasing funding for affordable housing, and as I said, over this Parliament will invest £3 billion, a record sum, to deliver 50,000 affordable homes. And it's exactly because I am, like Shelter, so concerned about the rise in rough sleeping in particular, that I announced in the programme for government the establishment of the Homelessness Strategy Group that Richard Leonard has just spoken about. And of course, within the first few weeks of that group being established, it had already made its first recommendations to help tackle rough sleeping this winter. The government accepted all of those recommendations and provided additional funding to help meet those recommendations. And we will, of course, consider on a continuing basis any further recommendations that that group brings forward. Of course, the reason rough sleeping is increasing are the welfare cuts being imposed on Scotland by the Tory government. And I again appeal to Richard. You've got Labour MSPs right now shaking their heads at the notion that welfare cuts are leading to an increase in rough sleeping. That, frankly, is a fact. So I would again call on Richard Leonard to join with those of us on these benches in calling for the devolution of all welfare powers to this Parliament so that we can put a stop to these cuts at source.
Richard Leonard.
Well, we'll see how committed you are to stopping these cuts this afternoon when you announce your budget. Presiding Officer, I want to share the experiences of a young woman in Edinburgh, Hannibal, who turned to the charity Crisis for help. She's a recovering drug addict and a survivor of domestic abuse. She became homeless. And this week marked 1 whole year of being stuck in unsuitable temporary accommodation. In that accommodation, she is faced with, and I quote her directly, "People smoke coming through the cracks in the walls and floors, sleeping in sheets that look like Swiss cheese from cigarette burns, blood spatter on the walls of the bathroom from people injecting heroin." What Hannibal and thousands like her need is an affordable home and the local authority services that will get her back on her feet. Hannibal does not have a choice, but First Minister, you do. So this afternoon, will you choose? Will you choose to use the powers of the Parliament to invest in Lifeline Council services and end Scotland's homelessness crisis once and for all?
First Minister.
We'll see in just a couple of hours the choices that this government is making to protect Scotland from the cuts that are being imposed by the Westminster Tory government. Now, the experience he has just outlined of Hannibal is completely unacceptable. That is why the Homelessness Strategy Group that we have already spoken about has as its remit not just tackling rough sleeping, but tackling the use and looking to improve the use of temporary accommodation. It's also why in the programme for government we announced an increase in funding to tackle alcohol and drug addiction, and why we are establishing, of course, a £50 million fund to help tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. So these and other measures will be outlined in our budget this afternoon. And when Richard Leonard does see the choices that we are making, I hope he will stay consistent with what he has been saying in this chamber and back the choices that we are making in this budget, because they are the right choices for the people of this country.
Patrick Harvie.
Well, one area where we don't have to wait any longer, one thing that we know won't be in the budget this afternoon, is a tax giveaway to the aviation industry. The SNP policy to halve and then scrap air departure tax was kicked down the road by just at least 1 year, ostensibly for technical reasons, and a consultation and economic assessment were planned. The results were published last week, and they were so unhelpful to the government that I can almost sympathise. Can the First Minister confirm that the consultation responses were overwhelmingly hostile to the government's policy, showing 96% opposition when all the responses were counted? And can she explain why one of the central economic arguments, that the bulk of the tax cut would benefit the wealthiest in society, was entirely ignored by the economic assessment?
First Minister.
Well, Patrick Harvie and I have had exchanges on this in the chamber in the past. Of course, we want to have balanced policies across the whole range of policy areas, policies that help to boost our economy as well as protect our public services, and that is the approach this government will take. Of course, as Patrick Harvie has said, this will not feature in the budget this afternoon, not ostensibly for technical reasons, but actually for technical reasons. We will continue to discuss these issues with the UK Government and, of course, report back to this Parliament in due course.
There's a few more supplementaries. The first from Liam MacArthur.
Thank you.